they have them upstairs.
What is like ridiculous?
All right, so if we think about the female reproductive system versus the male, they have some similarities in what they do. So the male reproductive system, we know testes produce sperm cells, the reproductive cell. Here's the equivalent in females, which would be what? The ovaries. However, there are some important differences too, because for the male reproductive system, all it needs to do is produce the sperm cells and deliver them to the female reproductive system. However, the female reproductive system needs to produce the egg cells, but then also allow the embryo and fetus to grow and develop inside of it during pregnancy. So there's a whole other part that's required from the female reproductive system. If we look at the diagram here, okay, we have a front view, okay, showing both of the ovaries. So there's one on each side, a right ovary, a left ovary. And like we just said, the job of the ovary, its function is to hold the eggs and also to make estrogen, or female sex hormone. The ovaries, the ovaries have a tube that leads from the ovary into the uterus. It's called the fallopian tube, and it's also sometimes called the oviduct. They mean the same thing. And this fallopian tube basically will carry the egg from the ovary into the uterus. It has cilia inside of it that kind of move the egg along so that it can get from the ovary into the uterus. This organ in the middle is sort of hollow. It's a hollow muscular organ. It's called the uterus. The uterus can expand and contract, expands during pregnancy and contracts back down afterwards. The uterus is where the embryo and the fetus are going to grow. Remember, is the baby inside the mother's stomach?
No.
No. That's a place filled with hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes. Not a good place for an embryo. It's in the uterus.
And why do they always say that?
I think they say that to explain to like little kids where the baby is. I mean, it's the abdomen area, you know, that section of the body. But when you say stomach, stomach isn't a word, a digestive organ. Just something people, I don't know, sometimes people say. I guess to simplify for little kids, the baby's in mommy's tummy. You just say it's a mom's uterus. That might be a little different. So the uterus is where the fetus will grow and spend, you know, all of its time developing until it's born. The opening of the uterus down here is called the cervix, and that connects. It's basically the opening of the uterus that leads to the vagina. And then the passageway out is the vagina. It's where sperm are deposited. It's also called the birth canal because that's how the baby gets out of the uterus. Just a couple things I wanted to tell you in this diagram. So if you remember, what was the name of a surgery a man could have if they no longer want to have children? Father children, I guess I should say. Remember the name of the surgery?
Hold on.
Jacob? No.
I think I know.
It's named after a part. Yeah. Vasectomy. Called vasectomy. Now there's an equivalent in the female. So if a woman decides she no longer wants to get pregnant, no longer ever wants to have kids, You know what it's called? What the name of the procedure she could have done? Jacob?
The fallopian tube sector.
You're right about what they do, but that's not exactly what they call it. Sometimes it's called a tubal ligation, or if you've ever heard of somebody say their tubes were tied, it means the same thing. It means,
Don't they say tying on it?
and what Jacob was just saying was sort of describing what they do. They take, it's basically the same kind of procedure, but they cut through the fallopian tube, they seal off the ends, and now when a woman releases an egg during ovulation, well, it can't get out, and there's no way for sperm cells to reach that egg, and therefore she can't become pregnant. So it's sort of a permanent form of birth control for women who never want to have children. It's called the tubal ligation. The other thing I wanted to mention here is the cervix, this opening of the uterus. It is an area where cancer can commonly develop. It's called cervical cancer. If you've heard of that, is when cancer forms in the cervix. And so different types of cancer can begin in different ways. Usually cancer is just your body cells, for some reason, start to grow out of control to form a tumor. It just happens sometimes. Other times cancer can be caused by some outside environmental factor, like smoking can lead to an increase in lung cancer. Chewing tobacco can lead to lip and throat cancer. Too much ultraviolet radiation can increase a person's chance of getting skin cancer. But there are also types of cancer that can be caused by a virus. And cervical cancer is one of those. There's a virus called the HPV virus, which, if a woman becomes infected with it, her chances of getting cervical cancer increase drastically. But there's now, within the last 10 years or so, a vaccine that has been developed which prevent women from getting infected by this HPV virus. And that means that most likely the incidence of cervical cancer is going to drop off significantly. It's called Gardasil. So if you ever heard of that vaccine, Gardasil, it's a vaccine that prevents, that's against this HPV virus. In fact, they generally don't, but they are considering giving it to men as well. Even though men can't get cervical cancer, they have no cervix, they can carry this virus. And it's transmitted sexually from men to women. And so by giving this vaccine to men, they can prevent it from being transferred to women as well. So it's a great development in vaccines because it can probably greatly reduce cervical cancer. All right. Any questions about the organs or their function? If we look at this sort of different view, we have, again, two ovaries connected by the oviduct or fallopian tube to the uterus, opening, and then the vagina. So we talked about men and the testes produce testosterone. What is the female equivalent to testosterone, the female sex hormone? So,
Estrogen.
yeah, estrogen. And it's produced in the ovaries. Now there's an important difference too in terms of ovaries versus testes in that. In men, the testes produce sperm cells sort of constantly. Millions and millions of sperm cells are produced by the testes. But in women, women never produce new egg cells. When a female is born, baby girl is born, inside of the immature ovaries, the eggs are already there, and no new ones will ever be formed. The ovaries have about 400 eggs at birth, and no new ones are ever created inside of the ovaries. What happens to those 400 eggs in the ovaries is that after puberty, every month or so, one of these eggs matures, sort of grows, and then is released. What's the name when that happens? When an egg is released from the ovary, there's a certain term we use. of these eggs matures. Usually it's either one ovary or the other. An egg starts to mature at 1 second month after the reproductive cycle is started. The female egg is the largest cell in the female body. This diagram shows the egg cell is much, much larger than a sperm cell. So the female sex cell is called the egg. And it's released from the ovary once a month into the oviduct, or also called the fallopian. As this egg moves through the fallopian tube, that's when it can be fertilized, in the fallopian tube. People sometimes get confused on this. If you remember when I was talking about the sperm cells, I said they had a long journey to make and they need to swim all the way to the egg cell. So the journey they need to make is they're deposited in the vagina during sex. And then they need to make their way through the cervix, through the uterus, into the fallopian tube up here, to the egg cell somewhere up here. So those sperm cells need to make that journey because after the egg cell gets down into the uterus, it's too late to be fertilized. It has to be fertilized in the fallopian tube somewhere. The egg cell, after it's released, sort of produces certain chemicals that the sperm cells are attracted to. It's kind of how the sperm cells know where to go to reach that egg cell. Okay, they're attracted to these chemicals given off by it. So fertilization happens in the fallopian tube. And that's also why after that tubal ligation, women can't become pregnant. Because these tubes are cut off here, or here, and then the sperm cells can't reach the egg over here. So they can't become pregnant. If they do though, if a sperm cell does reach the egg cell, first off, only a single sperm cell can fertilize an egg cell. Even though the male releases millions of sperm cells, only one fertilizes the egg. And when it does, we call that a zygote. A fertilized egg is called a zygote. So here you see a picture, it's a microscope image of an egg and a sperm cell starting to enter it. So, like I said, those sperm cells are attracted to chemicals from the egg cell. And as the sperm cells reach the egg, as soon as a single sperm cell goes into the egg, there's a sudden change that happens in the layer that surrounds the egg, and it becomes impervious to other sperm cells. They cannot get in. As soon as one sperm cell gets in there, the outer layer sort of shuts down, and no other sperm cells can get in. And that's important, because the sperm cells contain chromosomes, and there has to be the correct number of chromosomes in the zygote. What is the correct number of chromosomes in a normal human cell? Joe? 46. How many were in the sperm cell? 23. And the other 23 were in the egg cell. All humans got 23 of the chromosomes from their mother and 23 from their father. Half from the egg cell, half from the sperm cell. So if this sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell, it turns into this zygote. The zygote moves through the fallopian tube. These cilia kind of guide it along the way. And eventually, after maybe a week or so, it reaches the uterus. Now the uterus has been preparing for this. It's been sort of getting ready for a fertilized egg cell. What happens inside the uterus is the lining, the inside of the uterus, starts to become thickened with blood vessels and tissue. And this lining of the uterus, it's there to help support the embryo once it's attached. Because as this zygote and embryo gets into the uterus, floats down, and it sticks to the wall of the uterus somewhere. It attaches or embeds or implants, we might say. And it's going to stay there for all the pregnancy, all 40 weeks of pregnancy. That's where this fetus is going to grow. So as the egg is released, the lining of the uterus is getting enriched, getting thickened. Now what happens if the egg is not fertilized? What if there's no egg that's fertilized to attach? What happens to the lining of the uterus? Okay? Yeah, sort of. It starts to break down. There's no embryo, so it's not really needed anymore. And so it starts to disintegrate and break down. And it's shed out of the woman's body through the vagina, and that's what the menstrual period is. It's the lining of the uterus that's no longer needed. There was no embryo. So the lining of the uterus gets shed. Breaks down. Comes out of the woman's body. And that's what a period is. And then the process starts over again. In the next month, as the woman's ovulating, the lining of the uterus gets thickened. It's waiting for an embryo. There's no embryo there. The lining is shed again. And that's why women have a monthly menstrual cycle. It's sort of preparing the uterus and then the breaking down. Now, when a woman, what's one of the signs that a woman may suspect she might be pregnant? What's something that would lead her to go to the doctor to get a pregnancy test or something like that? Fire out the boys answering all night. We've never got consistent questions. This makes me worried, girls. Well, how does a woman know that she's maybe pregnant, Jamie?
Puberty?
Well, she might get morning sickness, but even sometimes before that. Nate?
She doesn't get her period.
Yeah, she doesn't get her period. And that should make sense. Because if she's pregnant, the lining of the uterus, it stays thickened. It stays enriched with these blood vessels, and it doesn't break down. And so she doesn't get her period. And so that may be a sign that she's possibly pregnant because she's not getting a normal period. That's because there may be an embryo attached there in the lining. And if a woman is pregnant, she won't get her period at all throughout all of her pregnancy. Because, again, if that lining were to break down, well, then the embryo is going to come with it. So if she's pregnant and it's a healthy pregnancy, she won't get her period at all throughout all of pregnancy, and even for a while afterwards. After even a woman gives birth, oftentimes she won't go back to her regular menstrual cycle until a little while after that. Also, when a woman becomes pregnant, the hormone levels in her body change. And that leads to other changes as well. In fact, a pregnancy test is a urine test that detects the presence of certain enzymes and chemicals in her urine that change when a woman's pregnant. Now, if she thinks she's pregnant, she probably would go to the doctor. They can do a more definitive blood test to see if she's pregnant. But those are usually the first sign. There's also tests a woman can take, similar urine tests, to tell when she's ovulating. When might a woman want to know if she's ovulating? So, yeah, she wants to get pregnant. If a woman wants to get pregnant, she may want to know when she's ovulating to increase her chances of getting pregnant, of that egg being able to be fertilized. So the uterus, the embryo grows, the fetus grows inside of the uterus throughout all of pregnancy. And eventually the uterus opens through the cervix, is the opening of the uterus, which is connected to the vagina, which is where the baby eventually will be born. Okay. All right, this diagram just sort of shows an overview of sort of what things look like throughout ovulation and the beginning of pregnancy. So you see here, this is the ovary. These little dots, they represent like the immature eggs, those 400 that are just in there, and they're just sort of waiting around until puberty, and then every month one of them, usually one, starts to mature and be released. Sometimes more than one can be released, and that could lead to multiple births. But one of these eggs each month starts to grow, gets surrounded by this little sort of bubble that's called the follicle, and it sort of moves towards the edge of the ovary, and then it breaks open. That's ovulation. And it releases the egg that's inside of there into this fallopian tube. So that's ovulation. That would be considered like day one. Now if it's fertilized, if at that time there's sperm present in the female reproductive system, okay, then they can fertilize the egg in this time. There's a window in which the egg can be fertilized. Around the time of ovulation, that's when a woman can become pregnant. Okay. So, if that cell is fertilized, then we call it the zygote, a fertilized egg. And as it's traveling through the fallopian tube, it starts to divide. It starts as a single cell. Then they divide and they form two cells. Then they form 4 and 8 and 16 and 32. Okay. By the time, a few days after, it's reached sort of the end of the fallopian tube, that point it's called a marula. Does anybody take Latin? Probably didn't learn the word yet. It means blackberry. It's because this looks like a tiny little ball of cells, all a little cluster of these round cells, kind of like a blackberry. It eventually makes its way into the uterus here, and this is when the lining has been thickened. It's been getting ready for this embryo. And so the embryo comes into the uterus, then eventually attaches somewhere to the side of the uterus, and then it's going to stay there for 40 weeks until the fetus is actually born. So that's sort of the, somebody grab that door, please. That's the way that embryo grows and develops. Any questions about that? Now there are times, once in a while, this fertilized egg doesn't make it into the uterus, and it may attach somewhere up here in the oviduct. And that's a dangerous situation for the mother. First off, the embryo would never grow and survive there, but it's called an ectopic pregnancy, and it could be very risky for the mother. So usually they would have to terminate the pregnancy if it happened to implant up here in the oviduct. But usually it doesn't. Usually it makes its way into the uterus and implants somewhere inside. All right, if we look at just sort of a slightly different view here of the reproductive organs, we'll label this one. This is a side view. So now we're looking sort of into the side of a woman, not straight from the front. So we can't see both ovaries, you just see one here. So we have the ovary. You can just draw lines if you want. So the ovary up here, attached to the fallopian tube, which leads into this organ. This is the uterus. You can see it's hollow on the inside. It's kind of like a pouch. And the uterus can expand to a great extent. When a woman's fully pregnant and has a big swollen abdomen, that's filled up with her uterus. That's where the fetus is growing. So after she gives birth, it can then shrink itself back down into a normal size again. So it has this amazing ability to accommodate that fetus that's inside. So this is the uterus. The opening down here is called the cervix. And just in front of the uterus is the bladder. So this is in a woman, the urinary bladder. And you can see it's real close by here, the uterus. So this also helps to explain why when a woman's pregnant, as her pregnancy is getting along and the baby's growing, it's pushing on the bladder and it's making it smaller. That's why women have to go to the bathroom a lot more, especially towards the very end of their pregnancy. The fetus that's inside there puts a lot of pressure. The cervix leads out of the body, that's the vagina. It's also where sperm are deposited during sex so that they can swim their way up into this oviduct to fertilize the egg. The opening that carries urine out of the bladder, this tube is the urethra. You can also see some other, so this is the end of the spine. So this would be like the sacrum, these bones. This is the back of the woman, this is the front. This is called the pubic bone. It's a part of the pelvis. It's just in front of the bladder. And then towards the back, this is the end of the large intestine. This is the rectum. All right, this will be our last slide here today. So we'll talk a little bit about what happens when the embryo is grown and starts to develop. So first off, it travels through the fallopian tube. That is where fertilization happens. In the fallopian tube. After it's fertilized, the egg reaches the uterus after about 6 days or so. So it takes a little while. It takes almost a week for this egg to get into the uterus. And if it is fertilized and attaches, the area where it attaches forms the placenta. And we know what the placenta is. Who could tell me what it is? What does the placenta do? We talked about it when we talked about mammals. Nick?
It has blood cells.
Well, it's blood vessels, we'd say.
And it brings nutrients.
Yeah, it's where nutrients and oxygen and carbon dioxide are all exchanged between the embryo and the mother's blood. So this is very important, this placenta. So this would be the placenta. And it's attached to the fetus through this cord called the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord is basically just filled with blood vessels carrying blood back and forth from the fetus to the placenta, vice versa. Now, how long is a pregnancy in a woman? How long does it last? Yeah?
40 weeks.
Yeah. Now, sometimes we say 9 months, but it's actually not quite 9 months. Usually the doctor will talk about it in terms of weeks. We say about 40 weeks is a normal average gestational period. That means how long it takes. Anywhere from 38 to 42 is sort of normal. Some women give birth a little earlier, some it takes a little longer. Generally, the doctor won't let it go more than 42 weeks. They'd probably induce labor, maybe do a C-section. And if it's much before 38 weeks, it's considered a premature birth, whereas all of the organs may not be fully functioning or formed. So the baby may need certain treatment if it's premature.
It's a C-section.
We'll talk about that probably tomorrow. Okay, so I'll say that. I'll tell you all about it. Now we have some different terms. You probably have heard me using the word embryo or fetus. Or what's the difference? We usually say it's embryo from 0 to 8 weeks. And then we start to call it a fetus after 8 weeks until it's born. And we call it baby. After it's born. It's a baby. Any questions about any of the things that we've covered today. Tomorrow we can talk about childbirth.
Tomorrow we're talking about what?
Talk about childbirth a little bit and development.